This circle stands for everything you might call spiritual in the Celtic cultures. To start finding our way around the circle, let's split it into two halves. On the left, M is for myth, the stories, poems, sacred narratives and symbolic worlds of belief. Then on the right, P is for practice, what people actually do, rituals, roles, habits and behaviours. Here at the top, this F stands for folk. This is the common people. Throughout history, the folk told their own versions of the stories and used whatever practices worked, regardless of where they came from. They weren't powerful, they didn't control many resources, but they kept their cultures alive in their own way. Now, obviously, there are many other categories we could include in the circle of Celtic spirituality, but for our purposes here, these will be plenty. Before the Romans conquered Britain in the year 43 of the Common Era, Bronze Age and Iron Age Celtic cultures had both sides of the circle working together. Myth, stories of gods and heroes and sacred order, and practice, the priestly world of the druids and other specialists. Then as Rome took control of Britain during the 1st century, they persecuted the Druids and forced them underground. The native practices they took care of, especially amongst the Celtic elite, became more difficult to access. The sacred stories probably continued, but the public, organised practice would have deteriorated. We can guess that, more often than not, the space left behind was filled by Roman cults and influences. But even though the people in power, closest to Roman governance, may have begun to lose connection to their native religion, the people who lived further away from that Roman influence would have maintained their native beliefs for far longer. Around the year 380 of the Common Era, Christianity becomes the official religion of the Roman Empire. From that time on, Christian religion increasingly becomes the dominant type of spirituality in the Celtic regions, especially amongst the elites. Practice becomes the domain of Christian priests. But what about the native myths? Well, some of us believe they survived in oral storytelling and were eventually written down by various types of scribes. These myths would have naturally evolved and changed in this Christian-dominated culture, but they still carried the potential for spiritual meaning, as they do today. So by the Middle Ages, the myths had largely become a type of literature, written down as stories not only to entertain, but also to inspire and educate. Think of the Welsh myth of King Arthur, whose legend spread across Europe during this time. Arthur is depicted as a Christian hero, but the older mythic potential wasn't erased, just adapted. Meanwhile, the folk kept doing what the folk always do, evolving their own storytelling traditions that were adjacent to the classical myths, and in practice just using what worked. Charms, local rites, seasonal customs, sometimes in a Christian style, sometimes not. They continued to tell their stories and express their beliefs, reinventing their own spiritual culture from generation to generation. Over the last 1,000 years, the main change for Celtic peoples has been the increasing dominance of English culture. By the early modern period, the Celtic nations were in various stages of colonisation, and even if they were officially Christian, many of their native myths had already been preserved in manuscript, as well as continuing to evolve in folk culture. Then we arrive at the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. In Britain in particular, antiquarians and revivalists started taking an interest in native Welsh traditions. The exotic figures of the Druid and the Bard captured the imagination of English and Welsh alike. Some people looked at the circle of Celtic spirituality and noticed that if you took Christianity away, the native practice was missing. Some myths were preserved in old writings, but the native circle was ultimately broken. Some people, like Iolo Morgannwg in Wales, experimented with new forms to bring native practice back to life, but it was still heavily influenced by Christianity. This is where many modern Druid orders trace their roots. This early type of Druidry was influenced by Freemasonry and Hermetic or high magic. Unfortunately for the folk, during the Industrial Revolution, their communities and culture experienced a devastating uprooting, the collapse of their local economies, often forcing them to leave their homes and move to the industrialized cities, or to emigrate in hope for a better life. We can guess their spiritual culture, by now a mixture of Christian and native paganism, slowly but surely disintegrates and breaks down. In the 20th century, more and more people were drawn to the idea of native spirituality in both Britain and Ireland, and therefore they were drawn to the Celtic myths. Just like the antiquarians of the 18th and 19th centuries, they kept trying to plug the gap they found in Celtic spirituality. Of course, by the 20th century, the various magical practices of Freemasonry and organisations like the Golden Dawn had had a profound influence on what Celtic spirituality meant. By the second half of the 20th century, more new practices are being imported to try to complete the circle of Celtic spirituality. We have things like neo-paganism, Wicca, Celtic shamanism, Celtic Buddhism, and many more. Like the very ancient culture of folk magic, when tradition breaks down, people simply turn to what works, regardless of where it comes from. Not only that, but many of these practices had themselves been refined over millennia before they were imported into Celtic spirituality. So they were effective. They do work in a spiritual sense. But here's the problem. Beginning with Iolo and throughout the following centuries, there's been an intense focus on practice, and very often those practices come to overshadow the myth. When practice starts telling myth what it must mean, the myth gets obscured. The Celtic stories are reduced to aesthetics or flavour or vibes for imported practices. In some cases, we end up with modern practices that look Celtic, but continually fail to actually learn from the meaning inside the Celtic myths themselves. Take the idea that medieval bards or Irish filly were shamans. Some elements in the bardic cultures of Ireland and Wales certainly look shaman-like, and scholars have noted parallels. But turning that into the Druids and the bards and the filly were all shamans is a misrepresentation of the Celtic traditions. That's practice projecting its categories onto myth instead of learning from the myths first. The major problem here, of course, is in misrepresenting historical identities. There are still Celtic peoples in Ireland and Wales and Scotland and Brittany and even Cornwall and the Isle of Man who still consider themselves to belong to the Celtic cultures. To misrepresent their history is to misrepresent their identities.